So yes, as Tim has said, so now we're talking about how do we translate these problems into action? What the companies need to do, what's good and bad, and what's going on. So what do companies need to do? I mean, in a way, this sort of repeats some of the dates and the targets. So I hope it's not stating the obvious, but if you're looking at a company and have an expectation of what you'd like to see, so this is it. So committing to net zero by 2050. So that this is the sort of easy commitment that sort of anyone could say, like you said. Of course, we'll do that. But covering the entire value chain, as it's called, or which is scope 1, 2, and 3. So particularly the supply chain. For some companies, that is clearly important. So making that initial commitment, setting out the transition plan, often called a net zero roadmap. So this is the next step in terms of, okay, we made the commitment, but starting to think about how we're actually going to do this. Interim targets are clearly important, like I've probably said more than once. Making sure you're not going to contribute to going over budget, ideally set every 5 years in line with the IPCC recommendation, and also covering all scopes. And then when you've done this, so this is your plan and your targets for, so that's reductions, then thinking about what is left. So these are the residual emissions, and focusing on removal of those, and the permanence being that. So that's a sequestration, locking that carbon up for the long term, ideally forever. So it's having this plan and sort of even should be calculating what those residual emissions might be, acknowledging that's quite difficult to do. And also there are many net zero focused groups and organisations, which is all about sort of collaboration and transparency. So being part of those is another factor. So when we do our assessment, it really sort of is focusing on those areas. We divide it into 4. So what's the commitment and the plan to achieve it? What reductions are in there? The interim targets again. What's the plan for residual emissions? Have they been calculated? And what are those memberships? Part of this, there was another webinar yesterday. I don't know if anyone saw it. It was a Reuters webinar, which was also about net zero, but it was actually talking to companies. I think it was Danone and Procter & Gamble, P&G. And one of the points from that was, which I'll sort of throw in here, was basically acknowledging it's not easy. They were talking about, again, it's easy to commit, it's easy to even sort of write these steps down, but in practice, it's difficult. And if you go back to the date again, 2018, and it's not that long ago. If you take that date as the sort of start of net zero, that IPCC report, it's not that long for sort of giant global companies to start doing things. It's not to say they shouldn't, but especially part of the talk yesterday was in the supply chain. So acknowledging when you're talking about scope 3 emissions in the supply chain and how they may be reduced. It can be difficult. There was one of the examples was transportation. If you have a sort of on-time supply chain and your ideal, more sustainable transport solution is not available, but you still have to get that product out on time, you might just have to switch to a less sustainable solution. And those sorts of issues are very, very difficult to address. So the good thing about this is it's obviously all being thought about, but these are things that need to be considered. It's not, as on the surface, it looks quite simple. Just do a plan and reduce your emissions. Lots of things need to occur. So a little bit more detail about what we look for. So in the commitment, so we divide it up into net zero greenhouse gases. So that's if the company has mentioned all of their emissions. And as we said earlier, it is commonly just carbon, but for some companies not. So have they taken that on board? So there's net zero greenhouse gases, net zero carbon, or are they really talking about being carbon neutral? So I've got quite a good example of that coming up. So sort of what's their focus? Have they sort of taken it all on board? The time frames clearly important. That's just noting the dates that they've got, and a lot of companies I think now are sort of went on board with the 2030s and the 2050 dates, and trying to make it earlier. Then looking at the plan in more detail. So again, this is our sort of notes, so there'll be a narrative on exactly what they're doing, whether there's a roadmap, the sort of easy things we talked about earlier, switching to renewable electricity. That's very common. Transition to electric fleet. These are sort of easy steps. And then there's talk about part of the plan being investing in the carbon capture technology, etc. Again, simple things as part of their commitment. Is there a specific overall target? Is the company actually, how specific are they being? And quite a key one again, like I've mentioned, whether the residual emissions are acknowledged. So there can be a lot of talk about reducing, which is great, but then sort of not acknowledging that there's always going to be some that you can't reduce, and what are you going to do about those? Is there a plan there? So here's an example. I hope some of the writing on there is quite small, but it's just getting across the concepts is what I'm trying to do. So here's that. This is Nestle. If that's not clear, so this is their roadmap. So on the surface, this all looks great with the things I've been talking about. So and here's the curve that we saw earlier. So emissions increasing and then start to reduce. And so here's the date. So you've got a 2025 date. So there's an interim target. There's another interim target for 2030, reduce emissions by 50%. And then so the roadmap and the plan is up here, how they're going to do it. So this all looks fantastic. Plant 200 million trees. So on one level, this is great. But when you look at it, maybe in slightly more detail, just to highlight a couple of sort of things I've alluded to. So planting 200 million trees. This is the point about offsetting. Not everybody could plant 200 million trees. Is that thing, where are you going to put them all? I think is a valid question, but that is not to say that shouldn't be part of Nestle's plan. It's just this sort of broader thinking. But the real point I think on here is all the news and the plan is great. I'm not saying it's not. It runs to 2030, and then after that, it's kind of not much. So 15% by 2030, and then we'll just deliver on our promise and get to net zero by 2050. So I just think that it's just a really interesting way of looking at it, and I think it's true to say that other companies are a bit like that. It's not sort of to blame anybody, but there's this sort of it's those easy wins. You can get to 2030, you can reduce by 50%. That's not going to be too hard. But what happens after that? It's a little bit unplanned, and you see comments like I think it's up here. There's sort of talk of investing in solutions, and the solutions aren't always defined. It's a bit better here, but it's fairly common to see that sort of thing. So we're investing in carbon capture, but that's sort of slightly unproven. And if that's the sort of central part of your plan, then it doesn't look too robust. But always with that caveat that this isn't a bad plan, and they all have to do something, and they're all working on it. But it's just something to sort of to bear in mind. So yeah, I thought hopefully that was an interesting example. Then moving on to just a little bit more on reductions in residuals, sort of having the point home a bit, as I like to do. So yeah, there's got to be an interim target? Is it science based? Again, is that great? It's a great term. It sounds really good if it's science based. And what does that mean? There are definitions fairly obviously of that. One of them, so in linear terms, it's a 2.5% reduction in emissions. That's for 2 degrees. For 1.5 degrees, 4.2% annual linear reduction. So it's quite a significant difference just for that half degree difference in implied temperature rise. So yeah, won't go into all the ins and outs of that, but yeah, there's obviously quite a lot of work there on what is science based and what isn't. is there an interim target for Scope 3? So this is one of the things that we're looking for in particular, because Scope 3 can be so important. It can be the majority of emissions for the company. So it's one of those signs. So is the company paying attention or doing the job properly, I suppose, is the only way to really put it. How are they considering Scope 3, and have they set that interim target for it, acknowledging that it's difficult, like we said. And then, yeah, on the residual emissions, I think I mentioned this one. Has the company sort of got that far? Has they thought, okay, when we've done all this work, there's still going to be X amount of emissions that we can't do anything about, and let's think about what we're going to do about those. Yeah, is there that plan for their removal on the last point there? So another example. So this is good old Apple. So just a couple of things to pull out. So one of them is on the terminology. So on the left here, so this is from 2020, I think, this commitment, but it's just to sort of illustrate the point of how companies can use the language. So Apple commits to be 100% carbon neutral for its supply chain products by 2030. So that's on the surface looks great, but they're using the phrase carbon neutral. We've talked about what that means, but then if you read the small text at the bottom, so they're already carbon neutral today. The company plans to bring its entire carbon footprint to net zero 20 years sooner than IPCC, so in 2030. So they've used the term interchangeably, carbon neutral and net zero. And as we have talked about, it really means a different thing. But that's not to say Apple is in any way bad. They're actually very good, and I think what they are talking about is net zero rather than being carbon neutral. Because if you look in their roadmap, so that's on the right here, they're reducing emissions by 75%. And then the second point, so carbon removal. So this is where they have calculated their likely residual emissions. So they think they will need up to 25% of the. So this is the whole value chain. 25% remaining will need to be removed. So that again is what you want to see. And they acknowledge that may be difficult, and they mention carbon offset as an interim solution. So that's yeah. I think that's interesting in terms of what we're trying to do with our information. So it's sort of teasing out what's really going on. So they've used a confusing terminology, but what's really going on is very good, and they've thought about everything they need to. Okay, I mentioned memberships earlier, so this is another thing that the ethical screening analysis looks at as part of this. Yeah, I said collaboration and transparency. There are a lot of things you can join. How you view these things in terms of is it sort of slightly promotion related? Everyone. I'm being cynical. Everyone sort of jumps on the bandwagon, and it's all about the actions really. So, but yeah, I think most of these are true and have good intentions, and you have probably heard of most of them. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but Science Based Targets Initiative have a large number of companies signed up now, and they've worked on the net zero standard. GFANZ, that Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is called that because I think they came out of COP26. Yes, it did, that because that was in Glasgow, so that's the origin of that. And there are all sorts of net zero asset managers initiative, net zero insurers initiatives that companies can sign up to. But good things, all about transparency, etc. And there's some specific ones for, I think, RE100, which is one that is here, so that's renewable energy 100, so committing to get 100% energy from renewables. So yeah, another part of what we look at. Okay, so I'm just checking the time. I've got a couple more slides with examples left, and then we're done. So yeah, two slides. The first one compares two similar companies doing things differently, so a couple of airlines, and the second one is just comparing two slightly random companies, but that again are doing things differently. So just to sort of illustrate what we see. So EasyJet has taken this on board in more of a doing things properly, if I can use that phrase. So they have committed to net zero carbon by 2050, which is pretty bold for an airline, I suppose we could say. They have a science-based target for 2030, so there's your interim target. It has been verified by the SBTi. So the well to wake is like a more of a life cycle analysis on the fuel. So that is to get their greenhouse gas emissions related to jet fuel. Yeah, it's all part of it. So they're really thinking about the problem and picking up on other things I've said. So their plan for residuals, they do have this plan to use direct air carbon capture and storage. That is one of the techniques. So it's investing in the technology to achieve that. So yeah, one of those you can see sort of good or bad. They're good that they're investing in it. Sort of bad, well, there's not much you can do about it. There's this sort of reliance to achieve net zero, this reliance on technology that isn't actually sort of there or proven yet. But you need to do something. So investing in it is all very good. So that's EasyJet. Wizz Air is, so we've got a good and a bad one here, really, fairly obviously. Wizz Air has no fixed commitment. They've said there's an aspiration for 2050. They haven't gone that far. They're committed to setting science-based targets. So they're obviously looking at it, but they haven't gone as far as the commitment, like I said. So there is no plan for their residual emissions. They just haven't got that far. So again, just illustrating that, yeah, companies at different points. Okay, so yes, two more examples for you. AstraZeneca. So this is an example of a sort of textbook example. So a company doing it all right, I guess, everything you'd expect. So they have net zero greenhouse gas by 2026, scope 1 and 2. So that's a very specific target. And scope 3 by 2045. So that's sort of looks like a fairly realistic date. Also before 2050. So that's a very strong commitment. Yeah, they've made these near and long-term science, so it's all science-based, and it covers all their emissions. So they're ticking the target box, and they have gone into the plan for residuals. So they're using one of the other acronyms, one of the other techniques. So this bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. But again, they've thought about it, and this is all part of their plan. And they use the phrase high quality. And they go a little bit further, which they say intention to be carbon negative from 2030. So that's very bold. So we'll remove more CO2 from the atmosphere than it emits. So yeah, AstraZeneca really a company doing sort of as much as you can be expected in this area. And then I'll flip it around to I just found Caterpillar, which is one that is not to say they're not doing anything, but again a bit like was there before. It's like they're sort of starting on the journey there. They've acknowledged something's going on, but they haven't put that resource in and gone into the details. So they support the goals of the Paris Agreement. Again, that's a fairly easy thing to say, but they do have a target to reduce scope 1 and 2, as is on the screen there, 30% by 2030. So that in itself is it's not a bad thing, but yeah, compared to other companies, they're sort of starting on their journey. And they haven't sort of looked at residuals or any plan for their removals. So that hopefully gives you a flavour of what is going on and the differences and what we're looking at. So yeah, that is my final slide. I don't have a concluding slide. How do we conclude? I've probably said more than once that there's good and bad going on. I think the progress that's being made, if you think about those dates again, 2018 is not that long ago. Everybody does need to move very fast with this. That's very widely acknowledged. and companies are doing a lot. Certainly, some companies really take it on board and making progress. Not, and as we've seen, not all of them, but so yeah, there's sort of very good news, but you don't. If you look at the bigger picture and emissions are still increasing, then yeah, you can start to feel a bit negative about it. But I think, yeah, the bigger picture, there's a lot going on, so I think there's some optimism there. So I'll leave it on that note.